has watched it live. So tonight, I'm delighted to introduce Peter Cole. Now, Peter is a partner of Ceres Properties, who are a highly talented group of professionals who advise the agricultural industry and developers on what potential exists to diversify farms and to generate alternative income. Alternative energy sources features in the media most weeks, and as we know, are key to protecting the future of this planet. Peter is an expert on this subject, and we're pretty privileged that he's agreed to join us tonight and talk us through the subject, Peter. So I will hand over to you, Peter.
Brilliant. Good afternoon, or good evening, all. A real pleasure to have the opportunity to talk to you today. So I'm just going to share my screen, which hopefully you can all see. I've put some slides together for you just so you can follow what I will be talking about. As Gordon did a good introduction there already in terms of, so my name's Peter Cole. I'm a partner at Ceres Property. So today, I'm just gonna quickly run through what we're gonna talk about. So one, who is Ceres Property, which I think is something that you may or may not have heard of us. I'll then just go really sort of high level, talk about sort of the different current energy schemes that are out there. Then I'll go into the market. So where we have been and where we're going to be going. As Gordon alluded to, I'll also talk about sort of why is this a hot topic, and are we on track to hit our net zero targets? And then I will talk about what I predominantly get involved with, which is sort of big developments, but also I'll sort of guide you from a business point of view, or even just from a personal point of view, on some kind of smaller developments that you can do to take advantage of sort of this hot topic. And then finally, I'll just give some blue sky thoughts on the future of energy, which hopefully might stem some interesting questions and discussions. I'm not really sure about the forum, but I'm assuming I'm just going to talk at you for some 20-30 minutes or so, and at the end we'll have questions. But if you have a really fighting spirit to sort of ask a question in the interim, sorry, these are my lights in the office, so they occasionally go out. So if I start having a knee-jerk reaction, that's not because I have this kind of twitch, it's just because I turn the lights on. But anyway, if you have any burning questions, just please do just let me know. So firstly, who we are. So Ceres Property was born initially from a company called Ceres Rural, which was set up in 2021 from a number of us all came from a large national property consultancy business. In 2021, Ceres Property was also formed, and I was brought on board to help grow the property side of the business. We have grown very quickly, and what started off with about 15 of us, we're now at a team of nearly 60, and it's sort of been actually wonderful to be part of that process. I must say part of that quick growth was very much helped by a sort of golden egg that we were gifted in terms of marketing our brand, and that came in the form of Amazon Prime show Clarkson Farms, which some of you may have watched. One of our Ceres Rural partners, a chap called Charlie Island, or who you may know as Cheerful Charlie, he was part of Jeremy Clarkson's agricultural advisory team and sort of heavily featured on the show. So actually, I think it is sort of the second most watched show on the UK Amazon Prime. So for us, absolute marketing gold, and stemmed a lot of work and clients as a result of it. In early this year, Ceres Property merged with a company called Fraser Halls Associates, in effect, to provide a sort of full suite of complementary property planning and development consultancy advice to our clients. Alongside this merger, basically Ceres Group was formed, and that basically brought the property and farming advisory team together, strengthen our brand, reach out to clients, both from a landowner's point of view, to developers, to public, to private bodies. So this is just a bit of a few jobs that we sort of services we provide on the property side. I won't dwell too much on this. But what I would say is sort of we get involved in all projects, and sort of projects, businesses, sort of clients as well, and whether that's a single property valuation you need, or even a large scale strategic development project, we'll take it on. I would say we are a young team. I'd say about 75% of us are under the age of 40, which, to be honest, I think is a bit of a USP for us, where it does bring like a really friendly environment to the business, but also to our clients. And we're quite, I would say, innovative, and there's a lot of drive and passion to try and grow within the company. Here's just some familiar faces that you may have seen if you're involved in the property sector at all. Some planning and development colleagues there, and myself and Michael Anderson, bottom left. We sort of head on the land consultancy side of the business. So a little bit about me. So I'm a chartered surveyor, and I specialise predominantly in 3 areas. One, which is energy, which we're talking to you today. Another one is compulsory purchase. So dealing with like large infrastructural schemes and acting for landowners. And then finally, sort of natural capital, which is sort of an emerging market. Now, interestingly, the compulsory purchase and natural capital all sort of blend into the energy piece, which I'll come on to sort of talk about. So it's all very complementary. So I'm the lead for the land consultancy team at Ceres Property over the 4 offices we have. That's a typo there. Saffron Walden, Oxford, Norwich, and Coggeshall in Essex. And yeah, so on the energy piece, I've sort of dealt with a lot of development deals, predominantly acting for landowners, but I have done jobs for developers. And as I said there, we're sort of dealing with various, on my compulsory purchase hat on, dealing with various national infrastructure schemes. And finally, I'm on the market advisory board to DEFRA for biodiversity net gain, which brings into this natural capital piece and all sort of sways into this energy sector. So starting high level, so what energy schemes are out there and what else I've sort of been involved with. So these are the schemes I've, well, not all of these, but these are just the ones from top to bottom, the ones I'm more prominent in. So solar is a big one. Battery is another sort of, solar and battery probably take up, I'd say, about 60 to 70% of my time. Hydrogen, there aren't many hydrogen sites at the moment, but I am dealing with one in England. I'm relatively skeptical about the hydrogen market. There's a huge amount of costs that go into electrolysis and the storage and the infrastructure that's required to transfer that hydrogen. But it's something that I think is generally being backed and supported by the government, but also a lot of money going in from various businesses. Wind, to be honest, I haven't been involved with wind for a long time now. There's recent announcement last week that particularly onshore wind, there's a glimmer of hope that might come back, because at the moment there's an effective ban on sort of reasonable onshore schemes. Offshore schemes I haven't been involved with, but I have been involved with in terms of the cabling that's maybe put in from these big wind farms off the North Sea. EV charging, yeah, heavily involved in that. So forecourt charging for your cars, various sites within England on where those and acting for landowners and implementing those. Others, which I'll just quickly glance over, is bioenergy. So yes, with the farming team, we work with a number of people who are putting in sort of AD plants, anaerobic digestive plants. Gas, yes, been in a number of gas generation sites. I was actually involved in the biggest one in Europe, which is down in Thurrock. But unfortunately, with Mr. Putin invading Ukraine, gas prices went crazy and that whole scheme had to change quite a bit. So, but that was an interesting one to get involved with. Nuclear, something that I've been involved with my compulsory purchase hat on, but I'm actually doing the national infrastructure scheme on those ones. And hydro and tidal, we're not quite in Scotland yet, but yeah, it's something that we'll be looking forward to get involved with once we maybe expand further. Cool. So I just wanted to really touch on sort of the history really on the electricity generation market. So what this slide is showing you is that this is where the production of various electricity generated from. So as you can see, sort of the coal and nuclear output has been dropping as the sort of older power plants have been shut and being sort of decommissioned. I think there's only one more coal plant running now. The old plants have basically been replaced with gas or renewables have sort of filled the lost capacities from those outputs. You'll see this for the annual fluctuations, and they're just seasonal. Basically, we generate and consume more power in the winter versus the summer. But this may change in the future as summers and winters basically become warmer. There has been a sort of general decline in electricity generation since the early 2000s. As you can see, sort of it slowly fades off. Furthermore, so there's been a sort of a general, I suppose, decline since the 1990s when looking at sort of all energy use as the country has sort of offshored so much sort of heavy industrial sites to sort of cheaper locations around the world. What I would say though is there is an expectation, this is basically now reversing as we electrify transport and heating. So a fact you want to take away and just consider with this graph is, so we're expected that this will sort of increase electricity demand by 50% by 2035 as a result of electrifying transport and heating. And therefore sort of the generation and also for the interconnectors, so connecting offshore, will need to increase, basically. Just something to point out, actually, which I thought would be interesting, is and probably didn't hit the press, but in 2022, 2023, you'll see there's quite a big dip there. Rather, we sort of it looks as if we start from a negative position. The negative position is actually the sort of the UK interconnectors feeding other countries rather than these countries ordinarily feeding the UK market. And this was caused by the French nuclear fleet, which basically had a significant structural issue with a lot of their nuclear plants. So they had to shut them down for maintenance. So this bumped up the electricity price in France, and therefore the power flowed from the UK into the French market, where typically it's the other way around. I just thought that was quite interesting. Whoops, a little. So this graph sort of really emphasizes the challenge ahead. So this is the government target at the moment is to decarbonize electricity in the UK by 2030. And as you can see, sort of the grey bars, we're doing well, but with the fact that I said earlier that we're going to be increasing our electricity demand by 50% into 2035, this is going to be a monumental challenge to try and hit this target. So this is taken from a blog that I follow, chap called Dr. Andrew Crossland, and if you've got a quiet evening, it's probably worth giving it a Google. It's called My Grid GB, and basically he takes live data and he constantly updating you on how much electricity we're producing by wind one day or solar by another. And he basically set out to estimate to get to 2030, we would need to do 3.2 gigawatts worth of new nuclear power stations, 3 times the amount of wind, 3 times the amount of solar, 1.5 times more power available for biomass, no coal, and 100 gigawatts of electricity storage, so batteries. I'm just throwing numbers, but hopefully you get the impression that it's a monumental task that the UK has got to try and overcome here. So why is this a hot topic? So putting it recently in the press, it's been a really hot topic, mainly around 2 points, is around the cost of living. So there is government support for sort of low income households, but this is a pinch on every business or even every homeowner. And the other one is the war in Ukraine, and a big push for the UK to be basically self-reliant on energy production. So another question is, government targets to hit net zero by 2050. Are we on track? In short, we are behind. So the last stat I was able to get from this is in 2021, we needed to increase our capacity by 129% in order to fulfill the demand to hit 2050 of the net zero carbon. I think there's been even more speculation around that since Rishi's announcement last week to sort of delay a few of their targets. And I think that'll be an interesting questions and queries at the end if you so wish to. So does planning align? So there is, in effect, as I said earlier, there's for onshore wind, there currently suffers an effective ban on development in England. There is a glimpse of hope from the National Planning Policy Framework, which had a slight amendment to it a few weeks ago, although the detail isn't quite there. And fundamentally, what we are, that slight amendment only really impacts only a handful of developments, so it doesn't solve the problem for wind. For solar, there is this continuing debate and trade-off with arable land for food production and for large-scale ground-based solar schemes, and also that sort of cumulative impact that it will have on the local sort of environment. And initially, this sort of blends in with sort of my other work I do on natural capital, where you're seeing the government's big push for sort of biodiversity and carbon, where they wanted to take productive land out and put it into trees and bumblebee food for the biodiversity, so these sort of things. And although I'm not trying to be too biased, I'm more than happy to have a debate about it. But I think broadly my views is a relatively weak argument on the food production piece, where we continue to import a huge amount of our food, and developers are encouraged when they do these sort of big sites is using low productive land, and they are looking at more innovative ways so that they can try and blend agriculture into these schemes. Planning is obviously very political. So when we took Liz Truss and her very brief stint, she was extremely anti ground-based solar. Rishi is more amenable to it, but I think the person who sort of talked most about it really is sort of Keir, and generally his views on development, albeit I don't know where, if you are a gambling person, but if you're thinking Labour to come in the next general election, but is this just one to win votes? Sorry, and we'll just have to wait and see. So what I would say, just finally on that planning piece, is developers are taking more risks, where we're seeing sort of developers go into the green belts. But fundamentally, the worst planning piece at the moment is this land quality argument. So they're trying to identify the sites that are low production of land. So do we have the infrastructure? In my mind, this is the biggest barrier at the moment. So simply put, the national grid and local network providers are running red hot, and they just don't have the capacity to cater for the supply of a lot of these new infrastructure schemes that are coming in. This is causing a few issues. One is the cost to connect. Developers are being asked to sort of contribute a heck of a lot of money to the connection and upgrades of the infrastructure. Sorry, light. Second point is sort of curtailment, and curtailment is something where for developers it's really important, because it's the amount of time that the network can allow your scheme, it can be big or small, but that amount of time you allow them to pump electricity onto the grid. So there's a lot of time the network goes, we can't allow you to pump on because the network is at full capacity. Another one is the transfer of that power. So there's a heck of a lot of electricity produced up in Scotland and off the North Sea, but actually the actual consumption of that electricity is around the big cities. So transferring that electricity down currently is a big issue, and also the infrastructure finally. So the things like with big storms and extreme hot weather, our current infrastructure just doesn't really isn't particularly suitable. We saw a huge amount of outages with various recent storms. So the last point there, are there any knock-on effects? Inevitably, there will be NIMBY attitude to any development, big or small. And although obviously it is very much a democratic right, I think the streamlining of development is going to be required for the government to hit those very ambitious energy targets. But what energy, but not only that, but also what energy provides. So car use of electricity. We're all being slowly phased into getting electric vehicles, massive demand for that. Data centers, all our phones, they all require data. And there's a huge amount of electricity that's required for all the data that is consumed and stored on your devices. And also sort of generally any development, any residential, any commercial property development, this is now really, if not the most, but right at the top on their agenda of items of seeing is a certain development scheme viable, because the cost to connect or the planning of the connect of how you're going to design your energy schemes doesn't tick all the boxes. So there are massive knock-on effects. Brilliant. So I'm now just going to go through firstly to the big developments and then go on to smaller scheme developments. But like I said, I get involved with a lot of big developments personally, but we do get involved with a number of smaller stuff from a lot of our clients, and we work with them and help them move on. But I think interesting from a business point of view, big developments is something that potentially is something definitely to consider. So these are the methods of connecting. And I think it's important to the background you understand this, and it does feed into the idea of smaller schemes as well. But the first way to connect is through what we call the transmission connection, and that's with the national grid infrastructure. So those are the very, very large sort of 400 kV lines that you see running in the countryside, and a lot of big developments, and this is now a very popular way of connecting. Big developments are looking into connecting to the transmission connection. What comes with connecting into there is the cost is so much higher. So with the cost being so high, they have to go economies of scale, they have to go big. So at the moment you might see, I don't know if it's in your local area, but there are various very large, let's say solar schemes, which can be anywhere from 500 acres up to 3,000 acres, that are either live or about to become public. And I personally am getting a lot of involved in quite a few of those. Also, you see very, very large scale battery schemes for the storage as well, connecting into transmission. So distribution is ordinary. Distribution connection is your district network operator, which I think for you will be UK Power Networks. And that is historically was the most popular way of connecting any big scheme. And when you are connecting in on a very small scale, domestic scale, that's the kind of connection that you'll be doing. Unfortunately, as I referred to earlier, because the lines are running red hot, all the low-hanging fruit has gone, and therefore you're not seeing a huge amount more of these sort of developments connecting in there, the big stuff. And even on a smaller scale, you're going to have, unfortunately, issues potentially with upgrades to the grid. And then finally is private wire. So this is when, and it's something I think interesting from any business or to think about, but if you neighbor let's say you've got a parcel of land that neighbors something that consumes a huge amount of electricity, that could be a gravel pit, a hospital, a school, something like that, then this is something definitely to consider. If you go as a business owner, you go knock on the door of your neighboring landowner, try and do a deal, or vice versa. If you've got land and you want to try and do deal elsewhere. And I'll come on to that later, but I think that's a really interesting one too, that is still really only emerging. And I think that will become very much more a popular form of connection. So I'm conscious of time. So what I'll do is sort of skim through these. But matters to consider if you're doing a big development. I'm just going to touch on a few. So the first one is which developer to go with. So I spend a lot of my time basically doing due diligence on a lot of development companies, and that could be small or big. And there's all these government targets. There's a huge amount of interest that goes into the market at the moment, and lots of money getting pumped in from various funds. So you just need to go with the right person. It's not all about the money. It's about the deliverability of that project. Method of development, I'm just going to sort of skim over that, but basically looking at, are you doing a joint venture, or are you de-risking and just letting a developer spend all the money and you take a rent at the end? So there's various different ways you can do that. I won't go over the numbers. I will touch on the additional source of income. So this is something that I think if you're doing it at home or you're doing it on a big scale, is looking at, okay, where can I actually receive additional income? Is that through merging what they call ecosystem services? So that could be carbon, biodiversity, nutrient neutrality, and how can this all play into place? Or, you know, design, how do you design it on a very small domestic level? So it's something just to think about that, and what, you know, enabling developments and things like that. Tax, I'm not a specialist in tax, but if you want to ask me questions on tax, feel free to. So going on to small developments, so I'm just going to focus really on solar, because this seems to be, we get loads of inquiries on small scale stuff with solar, and this is not putting solar on if you've got a building that you want to put it on, or you've got an unusually high electricity bill. This, you know, it's just worth just sort of talking you through what the approach is and what your options are. So your first fork in the road is where do you start? The first one is, do I go to a consultant? Do I go to somebody independent to say, could you appraise my site, understand it, give me a return on that investment and what it's going to cost, and then tender that site for you? So you get various bids, and then you instruct the fitter, and that's, in my mind, the most sensible and the most de-risk approach, to ensure that you've got everything, all your ducks in a line. But you can go directly to fitters, and there are, if you just give them a Google in your area, there'll be various people putting their hand up saying we can fit solar panels. At the moment, we're seeing that it's quite hard to justify for fitters to come around. There might be a huge amount of delay, and that's mainly because they're so busy and they're struggling to be sort of supply chain issues of bringing actually the panels in. But to encourage, you do want to go directly to a fitter. The way that you should really look to approach that to give them excitement is, one, provide them with electricity consumption, preferably over 3 years, your nearest meter, and any photos or plans you have of the building that you want to be putting your solar on. I put schemes under 1 megawatt. Now, 1 megawatt is quite big, and there's quite a lot of electricity you need to consume there, but there are various companies that want to do joint ventures or to install schemes that are under 1 megawatt. And I won't go into the depth of why that is, but that's something that I think is to consider. If you have got like a paddock or something about your house, and you want to, you know, put 4 or 5 acres to like this little solar scheme, but you don't want to spend £200,000 and actually the cost of that, then that could be an option. There are developers out there that we want to do joint ventures. Because of the next point, do it yourself. And finally, are there any grants? Yes, there are grants, to answer the question, but they are more based around low-income households that are potentially on some kind of government support payment. So we are currently really in a non-subsidy world if you want to do it on a commercial level. So finally, the future. So this is where I get a bit blue sky thinking. So firstly, technology improvement. So I got a lot of arguments about this to say that if you took what solar panels were 10, even 15 years ago, I actually on the weekend met with a developer who did the biggest solar scheme in Italy, I think in 2009, he said. and that was a 24 megawatt scheme, and that was 2008-9. Now you're seeing solar schemes that are 500 megawatts. So the technology has improved massively, and that's basically just down to the cost coming down, therefore they can go bigger. But there is arguments to say, well, can't we produce 10 acres of land in 10 to 15 years time to produce the same amount of output? So why do we have to take over 1,000 acres of land? Because maybe in 10, 15 years time, the same amount can be consumed out of such a small area. Now, we sort of crystal ball question that, and that is some developers, some landowners, sorry, don't want to even touch this because that's their view, which is I thought quite interesting. Technology replacement. So the anecdote I like to give here is we don't know if Elon Musk is going to create fusion technology out of a shoebox in 5-10 years time, which might make some of these energy schemes that we talked about just completely redundant. And although fusion technology, they're looking at potentially commercializing it in 40-50 years, what happens to all this infrastructure that we're putting in now if that ever comes off? So an interesting point there. And then finally, political support. I think if you take pretty much every political, the bigger political parties and political agenda, energy is at the sort of top end of that. But will that continue? We'll wait to see. Right, that's me. Hopefully that was of interest, and I'm more than happy to have any questions.
Thanks very much, Peter. It's a massive subject. I'm sure you could go on for hours talking about various alternatives. Can I just start with the first question? As well as government announcing an alleged relaxation on wind towers, they also said they're going to encourage small-scale nuclear stations, and they're going to announce the favoured contractors or the favoured suppliers this month, I think. Is that something you've looked at?
Yes, I think it is something that is going to be continued support by the government, even if we have the general election coming up, whichever political party takes over. My worry about it is the extreme costs. So, and where you have got a huge amount of money going into these other energy developments, I think it needs to be spread across the board. I think, as I referred to in my slides, about how there needs to be an equal shift of continued expansion with things like nuclear. I think it's 3.2 gigawatts that they want to support. So that is definitely something that I think broadly most people in this industry do support, but it doesn't neglect the idea of there's these continued wind, solar, biofuel, and particular battery storage that needs to continue as in line with those developments.
Okay, right. I'm going to invite questions. Peter, you need to unmute yourself. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, Peter, for the talk. Very wide-ranging, as we all know the subject is. I'm afraid your talk has done nothing to increase my confidence in what's going to happen over the next few years. You mentioned such things as the transmission arrangements, and you talked about it. You hear very little about it in the media. There are other areas like the amount of electricity that has to be generated. You talk about wind energy and solar energy, but the new amount of electricity needed for the cars that will need it if we go down the route of electrification as planned, again, is so massive that it seems difficult to see how it will be managed. And in a general sense, that there seems to be a magnificent lack of any coordination at the strategic level, at the highest level. Or is it just that we, ordinary people down here, are not getting a lot of good stuff that is going ahead, and that in fact we will in this country achieve the aims that we're setting out to do? And even if that happens, is there any point, bearing in mind what's happening in China, in India, in the United States, and for much of the rest of the world.
Crikey, yeah, there's a lot of points there. Yeah, no, I think as I referred to earlier, there's a huge amount of money being pumped into this sector from abroad because of the government's targets. But what we saw last week with Rishi Sunak, in particular, the sort of two main ones that he sort of announced was around delaying the production of electrifying the cars to 2035. So in effect, only at 2030, it was 2030 that as of all cars had to be electric. Now delayed to 35, and I think the what has that has resulted with is a huge amount of lack of confidence from investors and businesses within this, with generally, sorry, within the UK. And that's, you know, as a knock-on effect, that's put a huge amount of jobs on the line as well. So we have to go in line what the government targets are and what they've set themselves legally, and that's why we've seen a huge amount of money. But I think with what Rishi did last week, it has made a lot of people nervous. And if they can't stand by their word, what's going to happen into the future. But unfortunately, the reality is that we are in a real pickle. We've got a lot of debt, and costs are you can't just grow money on trees and do quantitative easing. So we're going to have to do something to try and to either cost saving or whatever to try and hit those targets. You're right that it isn't particularly marketed in terms of what the challenge we've got, because it's all very easy going on a tabloid and saying and reading some of a few lines, but there's so much detail into the fundamental issues that we've got to try and achieve these goals. And unfortunately, it's various different entities, and some of those entities have shareholders. So it's a real uphill battle, and I'm quietly skeptical that we're going to be able to achieve it. But we'll just have to wait and see.
Peter, obviously you've got lots of clients, I'm sure, want to put in solar schemes. What is the biggest obstacle to progress?
So on a big scale, the biggest obstacle, as I sort of referred to, was around infrastructure. So, and actually even on a smaller scale. So if I wanted to put some solar panels on my roof on my house tomorrow, I'd have to try and arrange this big connection into the grid for that. And I might have to wait 6 to 12 months before that is upgraded, before I can do that. On a very big scale, again, the infrastructure is I think, in my mind, the biggest challenge. So if I was going to prioritize the infrastructure, secondly would be planning. So planning, albeit, as I said, there is a very much a democratic right to object to various of these schemes that are quite large and will have various impacts on the outlook of the countryside. But we need to speed it up to be able to hit those targets the government has set themselves.
Judith, you have a question. You need to unmute. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Gordon. Really interesting, Peter. Thank you. There's a report in today's Times which reckons that solar and wind could power our entire UK electricity needs. And this could be done by balancing with hydrogen stored in salt mines. Given that my skepticism over hydrogen is about the same as yours, is this really the best storage option we've got?
So I think there needs, if it's just wind and electricity, the sun doesn't always shine and it's not always windy. So you've got to diversify your different energy. And that's exactly what I think the government is looking to do, hence the nuclear point that Gordon brought up. In terms of the hydrogen side that I'm dealing with, it isn't dealing in salt mines, but I can't remember the exact number, but I think it's something that hydrogen to be in its solid format, or even so liquid format, that needs to be like a minus 240 something. So the cost around doing that and getting into that that temperature is ridiculous. So that is why I think the one that I'm dealing with, they're trying to push quite hard into doing a lot of green hydrogen. So that you are taking that cost directly from a renewable source scheme, again, to then just to try and bring that cost down. But I think in my mind with hydrogen, the other big issue is just the infrastructure, how you transport that. The current infrastructure we have with the gas grid, and how that will then supply all the systems and the pipe work. There's a huge amount of upgrades that needs to be done, and all that comes at cost. So I like the idea of it, and I think everybody does like the idea of it. But it's much like the point on everybody likes the idea of hitting decarbonising electricity by 2030, but actually there's a huge amount of hurdles to overcome. And is that actually achievable? I think that's just, I'm quietly skeptical, but people are following where the money goes and where these governments are going, where the government ambition targets are going. So hence why I'm busy.
Okay, any other questions? Colin George, first of all?
Yeah, two questions. One was thinking about the technologies that you didn't mention, and I just wondered if it was knocked off by now, which is wave technology, because we have plenty of waves. Is it really just a matter of storage? The second question was, I think we're probably, all of us who are listening to you are about as skeptical as you are, with less information. But don't you think, is it fanciful to think that the political parties ought to have a plan B, that if we don't hit this, there are going to be consequences, and some preparation for those potential consequences ought to be made explicit?
Yeah. So going to the first point on the wave technology, you'll have to give me, it's something that I've never been involved with, and actually personally haven't really looked into it in a huge amount of detail. I think there was one that was off Swansea, which was more of a trial. Sorry?
Cardiff and Swansea, I think. Yeah,
and that, I think like we've seen particularly in solar, as the technology improves, and fundamentally, is there going to be different sources of renewable or alternative energy sources that we just don't know now? But broadly, to bluntly answer the question, no, I don't deal with it, and therefore I don't really know a huge amount about it, unfortunately.
Okay.
In terms of your second question, will there be a plan B? I think we're sort of hitting the nail on the head where Rishi last week said, look, don't worry, I'm making these exceptions to the rule, but we're definitely going to hit 2050 by net zero. It's, that is basically saying his plan B, don't worry, we're going to delay this, but we're still going to hit it, so it's fine. And it's everybody to get involved in politics to ensure that we hit those targets, and we try and get them to hit them. But where the issue lies is around where the priorities are, with the cost of living and what takes priority of helping out families and the issues we're having at the moment, or is the money should be pumped into things like this, which is more of a longer term play, which is the reality of it. So yeah, it's fundamentally, all of this is very politically driven. And this is why I think when I'm speaking to, as a result of the politics, sorry, this is driving a lot of these different kind of developments. Like no developer would have been talking to me about onshore wind for the last 10 years, but only in the last 6 months, they've had this whisper, and then everybody's now changing and looking and preparing to actually do this at that scale. So, and that's only just down to a political change in the planning system. So it has to adapt and change quite a lot, this sector. So if it doesn't hit those targets, are we going to see big shifts and changes? I suspect that will be the case.
Okay, thank you. Jim Tatchell.
Thanks, Peter and Gordon. Onshore wind, as you touched on, I think is interesting, but it's very conflicting, because you go and look at beautiful countryside landscape in Wales and Scotland, and what used to be beautiful landscape is now covered in turbines and is less beautiful. But obviously you'd rather produce the energy using that route than importing oil from Russia or gas from Russia or anything from Russia. But actually that's not where we need the power, though, is it? So your infrastructure point is such that that's where all the wind is. Over here in the southeast, where we need all the energy and power, I think people would be surprised, and a number of us are going to be walking across some countryside at the weekend, and there's some just behind Ian Hurst's picture I can see. A lot of that countryside is actually not really used much, and farming, any farmers on the call will probably sympathise when I say that costs are going up and yields are going down. At some point it's becoming less and less economically viable for people to grow crops, I guess. So are you seeing more potential to put solar, particularly on larger chunks of the southeast of the UK? And basically, how much land do you think there is that nobody would really notice if you put panels on it, because it's just rubbish land anyway? It's sort of a couple of miles away from the main road, so no one would see it.
Yeah.
Is there a lot, basically, is my question.
Yeah, there is. I mean, I think when these planning applications go in for these large scale solars, you're looking at this from an eagle's view, and it does look a large area, but actually when they are built out, at times, apart from the ones when you drive on the roadside, there's a big push for more recent developments for them to be very much trying to keep them in keeping with the local environment. So they're basically landscaped to the nth degree. So I think they are trying to be more accommodating with that. Also, developing on that point is, I feel the government could do more where you've got land that is not very good and it's in the middle of nowhere. I think the government could put more pressure on developers to potentially have more of a localized benefit for that scheme in that area. And there is currently a bit of work around that, and there are some obligations they are putting on developers to do that, as in basically providing cheaper electricity to the locals. But I think they could go further. We are seeing, a lot of land being put forward for solar, in particular. And this is all, like I say, a bit of a broken record, but driven around the costs of connection, and also that they need to go bigger as a result of that. But also doing it in an area where, like you quite rightly said, going where the consumers are. So that's down into the southeast. But you're always going to have this NIMBY attitude. and the big argument at the moment, which is sort of killing a lot of the solar schemes that are going out there, is this idea of land quality. And the crazy thing about it is you could have grade 3B land, and sorry, this is agricultural land classification. So basically, agricultural land is classified on 1, 2, 3, and there's actually 4, 5, but let's say 1, 2, 3. So 1 being the best agricultural land, and then 3 being lower quality. At the moment, developers aren't touching anything that is 1 or 2, and they're just trying to focus on the 3 quality. But the bonkers thing is that this year, potentially, some of the grade 3 land yielded more and better crops than grade 2 land. And it's just basically based on the weather and the conditions of the land at the time. So, and that's where I think the planners just go, look, it's grade 2, you know, it's a non-starter. But actually, when you reflect on it's actually agricultural production, where it could be rubbish land, or it could be even higher land, but it's not very productive at all. Then why can't that? And that's currently the big uphill battle that we're finding for any sort of large scale scheme.
Okay, any question? Peter Latham, did you have another question?
Well, yes, I've got thousands, but the one that sort of particularly I think is relevant to what's been said is you talked about the planning for major transmission grid throughout the country, and that will have to be expanded tremendously if the objectives for net zero to be achieved. Alternatively, or partly alternatively, is making local areas self-sufficient and obviating the need for this massive, or at least minimizing or reducing the need for this massive grid. Now, this is fundamental, or one of the fundamental items that needs to be considered, and yet I've seen from nowhere anybody who's been given any steer on this. Everybody's just saying, well, we'll try this and we'll try that and we'll try the other. It seems to be completely without focus and without direction. The whole project seems to be, and that particular aspect of it is an example.
Yeah. So the moment with the transmission line, the government are doing quite a lot of well, National Grid is looking at this and trying to overhaul their infrastructure. I think there is one in particular in East Anglia that you may have heard of, which is this very big overhead line running from Norwich all the way down to Tilbury. And that is trying to accommodate this flow of electricity, but
that's just one. That's just
exactly
one.
That's just one. But putting that into context is they don't think that's going to be built to, let's say, around 2030, and yet our government targets is that we need to have everything up and running by 2030 with all these other different sources of energy production. So the timings are all off, and I don't disagree with you that, and this comes back to this point on the planning piece, where if you want to try and hit these targets, we need to somehow streamline the planning process, and it's not a nice political move, and this is going to be the issue. So because it's this argument for the greater good, you know, we need to do this, which is a very fine line politically and generally in democracy, you know. So I mean, these so when you go very big and you connect to these transmission connections, a lot of these schemes are using a special kind of planning application called development consent order, and those basically classify that scheme as a national infrastructure scheme, and with that comes compulsory purchase powers. So again, that phases into my other line of work. So when they go really big, these schemes, they in effect apply to the Secretary of State for their planning application, and they get sign off from them. And then they have compulsory purchase powers to actually implement these schemes. And this is with the infrastructure, but also with the energy schemes. And the two are not really aligning, even with these big, very big national infrastructure schemes. So it's a little bit of a mess, in short, but everybody's trying to do going in the right direction, and we're but like anything, there's lots of red tape, and politics doesn't particularly at times help with the matter.
And Peter, we're likely to have a change of government in the next 12 months, and they will start from scratch again and reinvent the wheel, I'm guessing, which will be another thing. Does anyone on the call have any confidence so that we will achieve carbon neutrality by 2050? I see Peter has got his hand up.
Can you hear me?
I can hear you.
So far as I'm concerned, there's not a cat's chance in hell of us reaching it unless we get our act together.
Judith's going to tell us the real answer, I think.
Well, I'm not sure we're tackling it from the right standpoint. I think the point that was made by someone else that we've got to have Plan B, and I presume by that what he means is how do we cope with the rising temperature? And I would suggest that in this part of the world, it isn't exactly a disaster, and other parts of the world where it isn't exactly a disaster. I mean, there are significant consequences, but I think sooner or later we're going to have to get used to Plan B. We're going to have to settle on Plan B. That's my view.
So Judith, do you have confidence we're going to achieve our 2050 goal?
Well, I think we might well, but I think I would partly agree with Peter in that even if we do, I don't have confidence that the rest of the world will. And as a consequence, we should, Peter says it isn't a disaster, but if you live north of Cambridge, it could well be a disaster. So we should be investing more while we're trying to achieve net zero. Great. We should also be investing more in adaptation and mitigation. And the trouble is that all of these things cost a fortune. And we need better sea defences, things like that. And many of the issues such as transmission lines, you can solve the transmission line problem by, in some cases, offshoring them. It'd be perfectly feasible to do a line from Norfolk to Kent offshore, but it costs a lot more. So we need to start making choices between landscape and price. And at the moment, it's sort of the government is implicitly making those choices for us, or the planning. And maybe we should be clearer with people about the cost.
If you've got more money, it's not going to ruin anything, is it? It's just.
Joan, we're hearing Joan speaking, but.
Oh, sorry.
Oh, no.
Sorry.
No, right. It's a good point, Judith. And we hear the conversations about HS2. We don't seem to have money to do anything.
Yeah.
Any other questions?
HS2 is a massive project, but it's minuscule compared to what we're talking about with changing the whole infrastructure for energy in the country.
I think Peter mentioned that most power is used in the large urban communities. Well, London's the largest, and there is no infrastructure that can take sufficient power into London. And you can't stick overhead cables all the way into London to achieve that. Any other questions?
I'll just add into that last point, though. I would just say that this is why I think the government needs to be more supportive of actually, private money potentially being funded, because if the government's pulling things like HS2, it's clearly in a bit of a pickle. So
understatement.
Yeah, so there needs to be more support from and encouragement from others to invest in this country, and that would include potentially in our infrastructure. Now, there's a whole potential issues around that which we've seen in privatization, but that's just a whole different topic. But you know, I can't see why we can't, how we can get over this barrier and hit these targets unless we do that.
No, there's got to be legislation in place to force the policies.
Yeah.
And we can't rely on every planning application getting turned down because of a NIMBY attitude. That doesn't solve it. Okay, well, thank you all very much, and thank you, Peter. That was fascinating. And as I say, we will be publishing this on YouTube in the next few days. Our next speaker is Dangsha Trivedi, who's a professor of applied health research at University of Hertfordshire, and she'll be speaking about community involvement in health and health inequalities, which is another hot subject, which should be very interesting.
Mm-hmm.
So that just leaves me to invite you all to raise your glasses to toast the King, Rotary, and the people from around the world that seem to suffer so much. Thank you all, and good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, Peter.